Welcome everyone once again to this fifth webinar series on the ICJ Kenya and Strathmore webinar series on land and environment. Whenever I'm asked where I come from, I find real great difficulty in answering that question. To give an answer, I say I come from Wamdudu. Yes, I know that name sounds quite creepy, as if it is a place inhabited by many dudus. Well, it is quite true because it is located at the coast, specifically Kwale County. The place, as I'm told by my elders, got its name from the fact that it is near a beach, which is populated by a lot of small beach crabs. On the contrary, the place is not creepy at all, and is in fact a very scenic place that would definitely make you feel at home. A mixed feeling that I don't own up to because I'm a squatter in a land that my ancestors dwelt many years ago. My father, my father's father, and his father lived and were buried on it, yet I cannot say that it is my land. That is a quote that I've taken from a dissertation that I wrote in 2013. That is about 7 years ago. And for a very long time, we have seen in Kenya that land has become a problem in our community. Land in most African countries has been the spine of social and economic cultural, as well as cultural life. It is the nucleus of all forms of wealth and riches, a sign of power and control. As such, the haves have always preserved its control to demonstrate power and ensure maintenance of status quo. Now, in 2010, in the promulgation of the new constitution, the Kenyans thought of a transformative constitution that contemplated equity in terms of distribution of resources, including land. As we all know, land at the moment is one of the most resource that has not been equitably distributed as contemplated in the constitution. It is in this regard that ICJ Kenya and Strathmore University Law School thought about the discussion of land and environment. So today I'm joined with eminent personalities who will discuss the issue of land. I'm joined with Professor Amrina Manji, who is a professor of land and law and development at Cardiff since 2014. Before that, she was seconded to Nairobi as the director of the British Academy, British Institute in East Africa from 2010 to 2014. Amrina's research focuses on law and society in Africa. It is strongly interdisciplinary and collaborative. Her most recent book, The Struggle for Land and Justice in Kenya, which was published in 2020. Amrina has been invited to teach doctoral and postdoctoral classes in Nairobi, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Dakar, Addis Ababa, and Bogota. She was a president of the African Studies Association at the UK from 2018 to 2020 and is the co-editor of the journal African Affairs. I'm also joined with Mr. Smith Ouma, a PhD researcher at the Center for Law and Global Justice of Cardiff University. He researches on participatory land use planning as a tool for improving health outcomes in urban informal settlements. Dr. Francis Kariuki is a lecturer at Strathmore Law University where he teaches property law, family law, and succession law. He's an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, an arbitrator, and an accredited mediator of the Mediation Accreditation Committee. Dr. Gashenga Elizabeth is currently the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic and Student Affairs at Strathmore University, and a senior lecturer of law. Dr. Gashenga has research interest in environmental law, and particularly in the governance of natural resources, such as water, forests, oil, and gas, as well as renewable energy. Mr. Ishaq Abubakar Khatib is a board member as Save Lamu and a founder of Lamu Coastal Indigenous People's Rights for Development. Mr. Ngala Chome, a historian, a researcher, and a scholar, as well as a member of the Mijikenda community living at the coastal area. I'm also joined with my co-moderator, Professor Dr. Osogo Ambani. Welcome, Daktari. I'll give you over to you as we dive into the discussions. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you for that brilliant introduction, Silas. And this is the day we have been waiting for. I really wanted it to come quickly. Then we can go back to yesterday. And it is here. It's a day when we have an overdose of land law. As already mentioned, a powerful panel that is going to take us through the land issues in Kenya, be it intellectual issues on land, be it practical issues on land. I think this is the day to do it. And I think I'm really excited that the debate has begun and we want to begin rolling immediately. But before that, allow me to recognize the presence of students from Kabarak Law School and students from Strathmore Law School. I think it's exciting to have you here. If you have not been told, we have been running the Katiba series. This is, I think, the 5th webinar. And in these webinars, we reflect on our constitution. We reflect on where we were, where we are, and where we could be. And the idea is to get enough momentum towards the 27th of August when the 2010 Constitution turns 10. So it's really an exciting moment for us as we reflect and ponder on what we've done in the past and what we could do differently going forward. So welcome the two special groups that are sitting with us today. And all of us and the students as well, feel free to keep sending comments, to ask questions, to criticize, to challenge. We are open to all that kind of conversation as the conversation goes on. As you realize, the chapter 5 of the Constitution has two components. One is land and the other one is environment. And we're going to tackle both. Like I've already mentioned, the purpose is to look at the provisions of the Constitution. How well do they address the problems we have? How well have we executed them? And we're going to divide this conversation into two. The first 1 hour, we shall deal with land. And the next 1 hour, we shall deal with the environment. On the land panel, we're going to have Smith Otieno, who is going to take us through the discussion as a discussant. And then Professor Mbrina Manji and Ngala Chome, Francis Karaoke, will be responding to that conversation as we go on. The land panel, I have several questions to answer as this conversation develops. But I'll begin, of course, mildly as we move on to the other questions. And in between the conversation, I'll open up the plenary for comments and questions. But let's begin with the first question. Since I grew up, there has been this thing called the land question. I've always wondered who asked this question. And what is this question? What is it about? Has it been answered by the 2010 Constitution? Has it answered it satisfactorily? Okay. Has it answered it on the document alone and not in reality? Or the document has lived the reality of the day? I think that's the first question I want us to tackle. And to have that answered, I want to have Smith Otieno responding to it. Smith, are you ready?
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Ambani and everyone. I'm very excited to be with all of us today in this conversation. And as you rightly put it, this is a good point for us to have a reflection as to how the Constitution has performed with regards to specifically land and environment issues over the past 10 years. So I'll just set my timer. All right. So I have 10 minutes to just take us through what are these land issues, what are these land questions that we've been talking about even before the Constitution was enacted in 2010. This is a conversation that has been going on for a very long time since pre-colonial period, during the colonial period where they became more pronounced, and upon the attainment of independence, where Kenyans now thought that the land questions that have been deviling the country for the longest periods were ultimately going to be resolved. But we've had challenges along this path towards bringing or putting in place these reforms that Kenyans want with regards to land. And as you rightly put it, land is a primary means of production in many African societies, which means that there's definitely bound to be a lot of questions, a lot of disputes regarding land issues. And that's why it's important, the Constitution realized the importance of this as a means of productions and dedicated an entire chapter for it. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with everyone, and I'll just go straight to just trying to look at what are these land questions that we've been talking about. And the questions were in a way captured by the National Land Policy, the sessional paper number 9 of the National Land Policy of 2009. And in this National Land Policy, the policy divided some of these questions into 3 categories. That these questions have economic manifestations, they have political manifestations, and also they have environmental manifestation. And some of the contemporary manifestations of these questions have also been spelled out by the National Land Policy, which essentially includes things to do with rapid urbanization, which we see in our cities, the cities that we live in. Nairobi, for instance, is one of the cities which is faced with this challenge of rapid urbanization. We see the growth of informal settlements in different parts of the cities, which tells us something about land distribution and land ownership in the city. It tells us that there's skewed ownership and there's skewed distribution of land in the city. So as a result of that, we have this rapid and planned urbanization. The National Land Policy also listed disparities in land ownership as one of the manifestations of the land question. And we also see this not only in the cities, but also outside the city, where we have an equal distribution or unequal distribution of land, where we have certain individuals being rendered as landless. One of our panelists today told us that he's grown up as a squatter. So why do we have this kind of issue in a country where we also have people owning land that they do not really put to use? And the Constitution, as we'll discuss later on, envisions some of the remedies to problems or these problems of disparities in land ownership through envisioned legislations like a legislation of providing for minimum and maximum holding of land. But we are going to look at that in our subsequent discussion. So apart from that, also a manifestation or the land question manifests itself or manifested itself under the National Land Policy in the form of lack of a proper institutional framework to address those land challenges that the country has been faced with. And the policy had a number of prescriptions that we need to bring in place new institutions that are going to address these land questions or these land problems that the country has been facing. And the policy, for instance, recommended the establishment of a commission in the name of the National Land Commission, which was to be tasked with the management of land in the country. So those are some of the manifestations of the land question as are provided for by the National Land Policy. So we know how the constitutional journey began and where it, in a way, the ultimate point of this constitutional journey, which was in 2010 with the enactment of this new constitution. But the journey didn't stop there. Once the constitution was enacted, we had to have a proper framework for the implementation of its provisions. So we know that land also formed a key agenda in the Agenda 4 items that were proposed by the national during the national dialogue and reconciliation process that followed the disputed 2007 general elections. So just to go into the constitution and try to answer, does the constitution really address those land questions that we for a very long time been concerned with? The constitution, firstly, in Article 60 provides for what I consider to be an important element in answering these land questions. Article 60 specifically provides for the principles of land policies. These are essentially the guiding frameworks on how land is to be held, how land is to be managed in the country. And one of the guiding principles is equitable access to land. So the national land policy spelled an equal of a principle of land policy that land in the country shall be held in an equitable manner. The Constitution also guarantees security of land rights for every individual in the country, and it also envisions that the limited resources that we have in our country are going to be held and managed in a sustainable and productive manner. It also envisions a transparent and cost-effective administration of land, and this means that the institutions that will be put in place to ensure that these principles of land policy are implemented essentially. So we've said that the Constitution in 2010 dedicated an entire chapter on the question of land, and it deals with various aspects of land, from land holding to listing the typologies of land holding in the country, to establishing an institutional framework, a new institutional framework for the management and administration of land in the country. And the most important thing that I believe the Constitution spells out with regards to land holding, it says that land shall be held collectively by the nation. So we as Kenyans now collectively are endowed with this critical resource in the name of land, that the land in the country shall also be held collectively by communities. Yeah, and we'll see how this happens with regards to how communities are defined under the Constitution and under the Community Land Act. And also the Constitution recognizes that individuals can also hold land. So unlike the past where we had land being held by the government, now we have land being held collectively by us as Kenyans, as a citizenry. So this has a lot of implications, because any administrative institution is only going to hold this land in trust for the people. Yeah. So this is where the public trust principle really comes in, plays out importantly, that any entity, any governmental entity tasked with holding land for the people is to hold it in trust for the people. So one of the critical institutions that was established under this new constitutional framework is the National Land Commission, which is an independent commission established under Article 67 of the Constitution. And its mandate is also spelled out by the Constitution. And for this discussion, for conversation today, I would like to focus specifically on historical land injustices mandate. So under Article 67, the Commission is established and it is tasked with the management of public land, but it also has certain mandates that have implications on the management of private land and also community land. And specifically with regards to community land, this mandate on initiating investigations on its own initiative or through a complaint by any person into present and past historical land injustices, and to recommend appropriate redress. So this is a mandate that now the Commission is tasked with, to look into some of those land questions that the country has dealt with for the longest period. And under this mandate, the Commission has already begun exercising this historical land injustices mandate, which is further spelled out by the National Land Commission Act of 2012. So essentially, any individual who claims that possibly their land was, they were dispossessed of their land, or that they lost their land through whatever is considered to be a historical injustice, can bring before the Commission a complaint for that to be remedied. But we've also seen Parliament attempting, the next 1 minute, I'll just try to wrap up. We've also seen Parliament and the national government trying to claw back on these powers that have been vested by to the Commission by the Constitution. And for instance, we see this through the National Land Commission Act, where Parliament purported to put a limit on this historical land injustices mandate by the Commission, which is clearly unconstitutional, because under Article 67, the Constitution does not envision any limitation or any expiration of the National Land Commission's historical land injustices mandate. So I'll go, I'll look further, I'll delve delve deeply into these historical land injustices mandate later on. But for now, I think I'll just stop there because I think that is an overview of how far we've come with regards to some of these proposals that were envisioned under the Constitution. So, thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much, Smith, for sharing with us those great insights. I get from you that there was actually a land question. You have taken time to explain to us what that is, and you've said, for example, land inequalities in ownership and access to, to land, rapid urbanization, which has rendered many people landless. And you were saying that these were issues that were captured by various policy positions, including even Agenda 4, which is part of the framework that led to the 2010 Constitution. And you followed up with that to explain that the Constitution of 2010 was faithful in terms of incorporating these demands or these concerns, and that, however, when it comes to implementation, there's a sense to which government has been clawing back here and there. I think that's what I get you to be saying, and that's really a good place to start the conversation. For our participants, feel free to use the question and answer section to ask any question. You could also make a comment, and if you want to talk or to call in later, you are free to actually raise your hand on this using the devices of the WhatsApp Zoom platform. We should be able to get back to you. Professor Mbrina, I think I've captured what Smith has said. I don't know whether you agree with him. And even as we, we say this or while at it, Silas has already mentioned that you've just published a book touching on the struggle for land in this region. What's your take on what Smith is saying? Is he saying the truth? Do you agree with him partly, fully, or some areas and disagree with the other? What's your take? Where are we with the land question? Have we done well at the constitutional level and also the practical level? Have we done well in executing it or implementing it? Prof, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be here and for this whole series of seminars, which has been really very well organized and excellent to attend. As to whether I agree with Smith or not, the first thing to say here is that anything I know about land law in Kenya, I learned from Smith. So that's important to know. And he's given us a very thorough overview of the way in which we reached the point that the Constitution has a whole chapter dedicated to land. So chapter 5 is in itself an achievement that the Constitution recognizes how important the land question is, that it chooses to embed an entire chapter on this issue. So yes, at first glance, the question does address, the Constitution does address the land question. It has a whole chapter 5 on it. It tries to feed through into the constitutional provisions what the people told the CKRC they wanted in relation to land. So if you read the CKRC reports, what we learn is that the people wanted a more equal access to land. They wanted fairness in relation to distribution. They wanted transparency about who held what and how they acquired land. They wanted administration of land to be closer to the people. All of those things feed through into various parts of chapter 5. So given that, how do we explain the fact, and we know this, that since 2010, the Gini coefficient on land in Kenya has actually worsened. That is to say that land is more unequally distributed now than it was in 2010. How do we explain that, given that we have this wonderful chapter? Well, one way to do that, I think, is to think about Yashgai's comment that to understand the dynamics and the functions of constitutions and constitutionalism, you have to uncover the social and economic basis. In other words, you have to transcend the formal boundaries of the law. And that's partly what I want to try and do now in the next few minutes. So we have to, I think, understand the political and economic context beyond the written words of the Constitution. And we have to understand the historical meaning of land reform in Kenya. So in the late colonial period, we know that land reform was a defensive strategy, right? So there was a tactic which was do just enough in relation to land reform to satisfy demands, radical demands. Do just enough, don't do too much. Just do enough. And that habit has continued in the post-independence period, that way of dealing with demands over land. So the problem, in my view, is not that there's a lack of will in relation to land reform, but actually that there's a surfeit of will. There's a will to ensure, frankly, that land reform doesn't result in greater fairness, that land redistribution doesn't happen, and that you do just enough to look as if you're doing meaningful things in the land domain, but that you don't actually threaten any existing structures. So we're forced here with a glaring contradiction. This is what I mean about rising beyond the legal framework, the formal legal rules or the formal legal provisions in the Constitution, and looking at the social and economic basis with which we're faced. We're faced with a glaring contradiction, which is that we are asking a class who benefited and built their contemporary wealth on land exploitation also to be the trustees of reforming that system. And Issa Shivji says in his recent work, Accumulation in an African Periphery, that what you've had is the mantle of the settler, simply being taken over in the post-independence period. So that you've got a system in which racialization, or the practice of racial privilege, is simply taken over after the end of colonialism and turned into ethnic privilege. And Atieno Odhiambo described this in his writing around 2002 as, Kenya's problem of the tyranny of property, which can only be understood in relation to class formation. How is it that the haves are pitted against the have-nots? And that question, I think, remains more pertinent after 2010, even than it was before it. So this raises a number of questions, I think, that are difficult questions for lawyers in particular. And those questions are, have we put too much faith in the law and in the Constitution? By doing so, have we maybe obscured what should have been the more urgent debate, which remains the urgent debate, about what are our real choices? What are the real distributional choices we should make in relation to land? Have we, in other words, reduced the question of land reform, the land question? Have we reduced that land question to simply a question of land reform, rather than seeing it as widely as a question of land reform? Have we reduced it to a question of land law reform? And as lawyers, have we been complicit in that? Have we narrowed our focus too much and narrowed the questions that we are allowing to be asked by focusing so much on land law reform at the expense of a wider debate about what does land reform, what should or might land reform look like? How has the law been complicit in that? So in other words, we know, because we've all studied Guy and McCausland, we know that the law was the tool used in the colonial period to dispossess. And why is it that we're now seeing the law as the tool of liberation that will correct that dispossession? We need to question, I think, our kind of liberal legalism over this, and to see how law might have been implicated in quieting more radical demands, rather than actually ameliorating or improving or correcting injustices. Has law been used as a mechanism to quiet demands? Why have we not talked more clearly about distributional choices? Why have we not talked more about redistribution, about restitution, about a reckoning with dispossession? And if we want to ask those questions, then I think we have to move beyond law and the legal rules. And we have to ask ourselves, what, apart from law, what are our available intellectual resources? How else might we frame the land question? Leave the lawyer in us at the door and walk into the room with a different set of land questions. How might those look? And our legal training doesn't allow us easily to do that. Our self-understanding as lawyers predisposes us to ask the question through the lens of law. And I'm urging us maybe to try and leave that behind and to think, what are the other intellectual resources that we might draw on? What are the dangers of constitutional reform and land law reform as a strategy? Can we use law to shift the current hegemonic public grammar on land? Or do we have to move away from law entirely in order to find a new public grammar? Have we been too technicist? Have we focused too much on trying to get the institutions right and assumed that by doing that we would correct what we all know is a situation of maldistribution and land injustice? And have we, in doing that, enabled the suppression of more radical demands? I won't talk now about historical land injustices, but Smith will say more on this topic, and I think that is a theme that distills a lot of these questions that I'm raising, that shows why it is we need to move beyond simply the legal framework, the legal rules, the constitutional provisions, and to ask more pressing questions about the social and economic basis and context and historical context in particular, from which we're working.
Wow. Prof, you have challenged the assumptions that we know about law, and probably even risked the careers that some of us have, because we feel as lawyers and have been masquerading in that realm and benefiting from the nation. But here is the time to ask the question, is it even worthy keeping the faith in the law? Is the law going to be the tool to change the land question? Probably it is ill suited for that. I think that's what I get from Prof. Ambrina. And you kept challenging my brain from where I see it, at least. And if I could just use maybe two stories for village people, I think they could capture what you've said. One is the rat approach. You bite and blow. You know, that's how rats operate at night. You know, they bite you while you sleep, and to make sure you don't wake up, they blow. So you keep in that inertia, and they benefit. The second one is another story, again, from African folk tales, of the hyena taking care of the sheep. We seem to have given our trust to the hyenas to take care of our land. Is it going to be possible? Is it going to be possible that the hyenas will one day accept equitable distribution of land, for example? I think that's something that we need to keep thinking about. But Prof, before I release you to move to the next participant, what should we do when we keep this lawyer outside the door? Do we come with the guns? How do we come to this room now? With the stones, shouting, wailing? How do we come? How do we address our point? The law being outside the door. Do you want to tell us something or two before we can move on?
So I truly think that the way to start is to leave our identity as lawyers outside the door and to read history, to become historians of land again. And I think we do this at the beginning of our legal studies. And then we leave the questions that are raised by that historical sense behind us. So we read Guy and McCausland on public law, and we see how law is implicated in dispossession. But then the rest of our legal training doesn't take that insight to its conclusion and reverts to a kind of faith in the law and a faith in legal training and a sense that, you know, we must train our students to understand the legal rules. I think we need to make our students into good, our law students, a good law student is a good historian. That is somebody who can trace the continuities between land reform then and land reform now, who understands this question of the land question and the question of land reform is not a new one. In the colonial period, there were various stages of attempts at land reform. What were they trying to do? They were never answering the people's demands. They were only ever a kind of defensive strategy to try and do just enough to quiet demands for radical redistribution or for fairness in relation to land and the end of a system of racial privilege. And I think if we can do that, if we can, and Gala will, I'm sure, agree with me, if we can turn ourselves as lawyers first into historians and start to see the continuities, I think we would be also better lawyers, because we would see there's nothing new here. These attempts have been made before. And at the very least, we would develop a kind of skepticism about the limits of law in achieving what we want to achieve. So I'm not necessarily advocating, you know, law is not going to do anything for us, but I think we should approach it with a great deal of skepticism about what it can achieve in the land domain.
Prof, do you rule out a revolution? Prof, do you rule out a revolution, a possible revolution?
I don't rule out listening to the people when they ask questions about land. So I don't rule out having an open mind to what is it that the people demanded of the CKRC? What do they want? What is our archive on land? I talk about this in my book. We have a land archive in Kenya. And if I said to students, where would you go to read about the land question? They would cite these reports, right? You would cite the Jonjo report and you would cite the Dungu report. And these reports are really important. They do form a historical record. But beyond that, there is such a thing as the People's Archive on Land, which is not in published form in reports, but is the truth of the people about land and about the maldistribution of land and the consequences for them. And I hear that, I heard that in the introduction when we talk about our family, our father and our father's father talked about living on this land, but we were squatters. Or I hear that recorded in song, for example, or you know, in music, or in novels. You see that story told, and you need to listen to that story and then to think about, well, what would it mean to answer some of those demands for land outside of a kind of formalist, you know, the Constitution will give us Chapter 5, and from there we will get the right institutions, and that will inevitably lead to transparency and a fairer system of land distribution.
Wow, thank you. Food for thought. I think for all of us, not just me here, I think all of us have to reflect on that as the discussion goes on, and probably for many years after this. And actually, I think it's called serendipitous. That's one of the words I learned, and I've never learned how to pronounce serendipity.
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 Yeah, it actually happens that we have a historian coming after Prof. Ngala Chome has done his work on coast, the history of coast and land, coast and environment. And I think you are the right person to come right now. To just respond to what has happened between Smith and Professor Mrina. What's your take on that conversation?
I mean, I really agree, but before I said that, I have to thank you for inviting me to be part of this high-powered panel, and you know, to discuss what is seemingly a very important question, the land question. I really agree with kind of taking longer historical approaches in trying to understand some of these questions, and also the political economy involved in a thing as important as land. On the coast, it's very important, for example, to look at how the state, in this case, the colonial state, redistributed land, especially in the early 1900s, and how that then sort of set the tone or had a legacy for struggles around land on the coast, but also struggles around land during the post-colonial period as well. And the 1908 Land Titles Ordinance, for example, is very key in this sense. You know that between 1910 and 1924, the colonial state redistributed land in Mombasa and all areas around the coast. And the coast is important in this sense because it was felt that since you had already different kind of regimes of land ownership on the coast that had developed since the middle of the 19th century, in the 1850s, especially along what was called the coastal strip. The colonial state felt that it was important to formalize, as they put it, land ownership on the coast, because to anticipate many kind of disputes in that area. What is important to recognize is that the colonial state redistributed not only land but resources and political rights using race as a kind of the distinguishing feature of the people of the territory. And on the coast, the assumption was that those who were deemed to be Africans or natives had not developed a concept of individual land ownership. And that only those who could prove that they were not African would be issued with individual titles, freehold and some on lease on the coast. Of course, the idea was to support European-based plantation agriculture, which did not actually succeed on the coast. And most of the titles ended up in the hands of Indians, but people who were thought to be Arabs and Europeans. So in less than a decade, thousands and thousands of acres had fallen into the number of a few families, forming, according to me, what then becomes the problem, the coastal land problem. Just to give an example, claims that were made by people calling themselves Swahilis, for instance, during this time, were all denied by the state, and these were claims to communal or community land in large stretches of land outside Mombasa, but also in Lamu as well. In fact, the place that the government has planned to put up a special economic zone in Lamu falls under these claims that were made by elders in the 1920s. There is another attempt to redistribute land on the coast in the 1950s, I think around 1958, for example. But pretty much nothing is done during the post-independence period that seriously tilts this kind of land redistribution that happened during the colonial period. So of course, we know that the post-independence governments designed a few settlement schemes on the coast. The most well-known, Shimba Hills in Kwale, Peketoni in Lamu, but also in areas such as Magarini in Malindi. But many people who were denied rights to their land and land ownership remained landless for most of the post-independence period. And a lot of the ownership of land on the coast has remained on the hands of a few Arab families, few Europeans, and an additional kind of, I would say, elite group that came, kind of the post-colonial political elites also were able to insert themselves in this tiny clique of landowners on the coast. So communities such as the Mijikenda, in this sense, I really like the introduction that was given to kickstart this conversation today. Now, that's very true, where you have many families living close to the coastal strip, living on land that they do not own, and for generations. So for me, I think this is the context at which one should now begin to understand the problem and the struggles around land on the coast. During the post-independence period, this now, of course, leads to the constant threats of evictions, when it is easy, for example, for one with money and connections, to get ownership of land on which people have lived for generations. This problem of private developer, becomes very, very widespread on the coast. The other area in which, this legacy of kind of land distribution from the colonial period and after complicates now it's kind of mega infrastructure projects and mineral extraction projects. Again, in an area where most of the land belongs to a few individuals, but also to the government, and an area with a legacy of demands and claims on the land from people who are made squatters generations ago. It kind of complicates how now the state deals with these demands in an era of, especially since the Kibaki regime, of an increased interest in this sort of mega infrastructure investments. So, and there have been many projects of this nature on the coast in the last 20 years or 15 years. You're talking about sort of the base titanium mining in Kwale, talking about the planned Dongokundu Special Economic Zone outside of Mombasa, but also much more recently, the standard gauge railway, which starts in Mombasa as well, and also the LAPSET project in Lamu. That you see that in all these sort of projects, these historical questions around land ownership and claims and demands on land have been invigorated again in ways in which these projects have been implemented. So for one to try and understand, so for one to understand what has been the role of the new constitution in kind of these debates, what is the role of history in kind of these debates, looking at how the state has managed or has handled the land question through these ongoing and planned infrastructure projects is very key. And I think, we have someone from Lamu, Isaac, who will give us the details of these ongoings in a place like Lamu.
Wow. Thank you very much, Ngala, for putting everything into context. I see you saying that, yes, there was a past, there's a history to this, but it seems that the history is still developing and that there are new ways in which, again, we continue to perpetrate violations. So, for example, the mega infrastructural projects we have been implementing at the coast. And it seems that we shall keep coming there. That's the port of Kenya. We shall keep building big ports, huge infrastructure projects, probably bigger airports than you can see now. And obviously we continue to mess up with the people at the coast. Quite illuminating. Silas, there are some questions already, I'm sure.
Yes, sure.
And I think we can go to that first round of questions and see how that goes.
Sure, Prof. And the questions I'm seeing remind me of some comments and an interview by Professor Okoth Ogendo way back when he said private registration of land was utilized to deprive people, because before that, communal land, land was communal in Africa, and Ngala Chome and other panelists have told us this. So one question from Philip Njoroge, he's asking, what are your views on the possibility of recovering our original African and Kenyan approach with regards to land? That is communal land, the communal land approach. And I think this goes to Professor Ambrina. Another question, how do we practically enforce a principle which was effective before law was developed in this country? I think this question is together with the previous one to Professor from Philip Njoroge. And then lastly, how about the millennial generation? That has been completely alienated from their heritage in the recovery of our African views of property through institutional reforms. I think Phillips agrees that land and culture are quite are closely related. So what about the millennial generation? Another question from Mr. Samuel Mohochi, our former executive director at ICJ. Land is a factor of production, and the failure to properly manage and unlock its equity cannot be achieved in the sense of law. Can Professor elaborate how mischief giving to the land question in Kenya can be resolved? Yeah. And then to all panelists, perhaps the land question, like all other aspects of civic engagement, as a country is a victim of capture, vested interests and that do not want real and meaningful reforms, land and access to control, to political power and twined spheres of control. So I think this one, maybe I can ask to Smith, how are we able to, to Dr. Kariuki, how are we able to sort of address the issue of political power and land? How can we go around it? And then another question, can appropriation of land without compensation from those with huge chunks of land is what, of course, what Professor is alluding to, radicalism. So how can compensation be effected, basically? So maybe with those few questions first, then we can move over to you, Dr. Osogo.
Yeah, I think let's address those sets of questions, then we shall again open up for plenary. Kariuki, you want to start? Kariuki, if you could address the two questions that were asked, the last two.
Okay, thank you, organizers, for extending the invitation to me to participate and also learn from the experts who have just spoken. And I think just to respond to those questions and also add my voice on the question about the land question or questions, I think mine would be just to add on what Smith said and Prof. Ambrina, that in my view, I think we need to, in terms of framing the question, we need to broaden it so that we are not talking about a land question only. We are talking about a land questions, because when you look at the history that has been expounded by previous panelists, the land questions in this country actually, it embodies a number of dimensions. There is the legal that Smith has talked about. There is the economic, there is the political that the question actually is referring to. There are geopolitical dimensions to the land question. There is the ecological question about conservation, and there are even cultural. There are religious dimensions to the land question. And so for me, I think even when we look to law, to the Constitution and to the other land laws and the many policies that we are talking about, I think, and I agree with Prof, that I think we need to separate and distance lawyers from the debate, because if the land questions are, eliciting all these, multiplicity of issues, then the lawyer cannot be the only, a person or entity that can resolve these diverse issues attending to land. And that's why, in my view, I think also as lawyers, we have been a bit lazy. We have taken, that posturing that through law, and by law, I mean formal law, statute law, we think and we believe that formal law has the solution to dealing with the land question or questions in this country. And I think for me, it's high time, we understand and we look at law beyond the lenses of formal law, statute law, and ask ourselves, are there other, normative orderings, that we can resort to help us respond to these, diverse issues. For example, how has the Constitution responded to the cultural, religious connotations of the land issue, especially from our local community's perspective, and you realize that, statute law, formal law is not actually, adequate in dealing with some of those concerns. The geopolitical issues, the law may not be adequate in that respect. So in my view, I think we need to take an approach like the one taken by Rwanda, for example, when dealing with the cases of genocide, where the people of Rwanda decided that yes, the prescriptions by the the global community are good, but we have our own indigenous processes and mechanisms that we can harness in dealing with the issue of genocide. And perhaps through those approaches, we can be able to transcend the fetters of formal law and statute law and address a number of other issues that come with the restrictions of formal law. And again, I would think that even in that debate, we, even in terms of our training, our legal training, of our lawyers and our other, specialists in the land arena, we need to engage in a serious debate about the colonization of the law. We can't assume that the law, is neutral, that the law will favor that of Giek man, who is hunting and gathering in the Mau forest. We can't assume, and this assumption we have, that, by enacting the 2010 Constitution, we will deal with the issues of dispossessions of local communities. Why are dispossessions taking place today of local communities, of IDPs? Yet we have one of the best constitutions in the world. And that's why, in my view, we need to think about, other strategies. Can we even, in a more pragmatic and in a more, deliberate manner, for example, go to customary laws, our various customary laws, and it is possible globally around the world. There is evidence, for example, that through customary laws, communities have been able to conserve their natural resources effectively. There is evidence of the Amazons, the evidence of the Mijikenda Kaya forest, and this has been recognized globally. So I think also, to add on Prof's comment, there is some laziness from us lawyers, from us scholars, from us researchers, because we take what we have been given by donors, and these people who are pushing for land law reforms, and we take it as a gospel truth. So, and I agree again with Ngala, why do we have, extractive industries, the mining by tallow oil taking place over community land, when free, prior informed consent of those peoples, of those communities was not obtained? Why do we have the cases of mining in base titanium, in Kwale, when the communities were not adequately compensated for the loss of their lands? Why do we have these mega infrastructural projects like LAPSET, like SGR, being put on sites of critical cultural and spiritual significance to communities? Yet we are saying we have a law that recognizes the cultural rights of communities. So that's why for me, I think when I look at the land questions and what we have in the Constitution, it is not enough. And for example, when you are dealing with the issue of unequitable land disparities, we need to look beyond. It's not just a question of the, land, getting land, but getting land is critical for food security. Because we know, for example, in our rural areas, the food producers are the women. So if you have these unequal land disparities, where women do not have land rights, they cannot make critical decisions over land, then it means food security, for our people will be jeopardized. Again, from a gender dimension perspective, the law is saying, Article 45 is saying about equality in the family. The law is saying enact laws, but that has not again happened. Again, meaning that, perhaps there is a huge disconnect between the prescriptions of the law, and what, our leaders and our people can respond to. And perhaps due to lack of that legitimacy, I think that's why we are having these huge disconnect. And again, I look at the issue of tenure insecurity. So when we say we have responded to the land question, why do we still have cases of tenure insecurity? Why are the people in the Rift Valley, the Madoadoas, in fear every electioneering period? People who have title deeds of a private land, why do they have that kind of fear if the law has adequately addressed the issue of tenure security? Why are the indigenous peoples, the local communities in Turkana, why is their land being taken without, their consultation, without free, prior, informed consent? Yet we are saying in the Constitution that all tenure categories are equal. They have, they should be treated equally by law. So it means, according to me, that something is amiss somewhere. Why do we have evictions even during COVID-19? Yet we are saying we have formal law, state law, we have a constitution, we have the most advanced constitution. Again, when I look at the legal dimension, yes, we have the law, which is good in paper, but still, we still see how the legal technicists, the political actors are still, using the legal processes, to go back, to reconcile from the previous prescriptions of the law. For example, the tussles between the NLC, and the Ministry of Land, actually is a clear demonstration that there is no respect for law. That we can disturb the prescriptions in the law the way we want to fit, our needs, the way we want. And this, I think it's the place where the political goodwill, if, for example, we are to use formal law or statute law that we have, I think we need very deliberate political goodwill by our political leaders to provide the needed support to our institutions dealing with land law, dealing with land management and land administration. And of course, because of the vested interest that these leaders have, that's why reports such as the TJRC report, the Ndongo Land report cannot be implemented, cannot be tabled in Parliament for discussion. And I'm saying this in response to the issue about political power and land, because they are inextricably linked. Because those who are wielding power today, it is a fact in the public domain, those wielding power are the ones who are who have accumulated large parcels of land. And through the law, they may not be able to account for how they acquired those parcels of land. And lastly, I think on the ecological dimension, again, I think we need to look at the land questions holistically in a more comprehensive manner, because and this speaks also to our focus towards our conceptualization of law, because we tend to talk of land reform, land law, and think about the physical solemn alone, the soil. But we forget that there are other rights, in those lands, the issues of the environment. It's part of the land, and as we do whatever we do, as we amend the laws the way we want, at the end of the day, we are destroying also our ecology. And this brings about the global issues, the geopolitical issues, which are to do with climate change and global warming, meaning that even as we deal with the land questions here locally, we must also be alive to the threat that is posed by climate change and global warming. And this is an issue of life and death. You know, it's either we take very deliberate efforts towards the conservation of our natural resources and our land-based resources, or else we will, you know, have to deal with the various threats being posed by climate change and global warming around the world. And that's why for me, I would advise or suggest that we go beyond the formal law, statute law, and ask ourselves, can we find some answers, maybe in customary laws and customary governance systems and institutions? And I think it's possible. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. You know, when you spoke, I almost said, preach, preacher, preach, keep preaching. And thank you for bringing in the African touch to it also. I think for those who know me, I dedicate my life to studies in decolonization, Pan-Africanism, you know, and those kind of things. So I'm really excited that you preached for me as well. Prof. Ambrina, there were questions addressed to you. Is it possible to do them in, say, less than 3 minutes? And then have your take on the National Land Commission. Again, in a minute or so. Was it a success? Was it a complete failure? Was it part success, part failure? It will really be interesting to see your evaluation, the progress made on that front. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. So the question that was addressed to me was really this question of, you know, can we try to reconnect with or rediscover particularly African perspective on land? And this, I think, is a question, and it is a question about what are our available intellectual resources and looking more widely than just the law for those intellectual resources. And I think this is where someone like Okoth Ogendo is really underestimated as a scholar on whom we can draw for these kinds of wider perspectives. Because what Okoth Ogendo was trying to do when he wrote about land, I think, was not just to show what material issues were at stake, although he did that very well, but also to show how colonialism was a form of ontological assault and how the project was effectively to replace an African way of seeing land and relating to land with what was seen as a modern way. So to replace community understandings, customary law with individual title and registration, and to valorize those ways of thinking and to demean ways of thinking about land which were not about individual ownership of land. And we see that in the present day. So we still have this obsession with the idea of private ownership of land. Anything short of that is less than good, less than effective, less than economically efficient. That's true in international land policy, and it's also true nationally. So what I think Okoth Ogendo is a key resource for us if we're thinking about how do we teach, for example, our students about land law? How do we reconnect them with the decolonized way of thinking about land? Okoth Ogendo was doing that before anybody else, and what he was touching on was what are the ontological connections with land that we must understand. And in the South African context, Krog talks about this when she writes, you know, this is not about does land belong to us? It's about, do we belong to land? Are we land owned? And if you think about people as understanding themselves as land owned, then you understand what Okoth Ogendo was getting at when he said this is a way of reconnecting with the idea that people saw their land as a productive asset, but a transgenerational asset as well. And that gave them some rights, but it also really importantly gave them responsibilities about preserving and looking after and having ecological responsibilities towards that land. For me, I think that's really crucial to reconnect with that body of scholarship if you're to do anything to teach our students decolonized land law that really understands land beyond simply a kind of lawyer's land law. On the NLC, I mean, we could speak all day about this. I think it's really interesting to watch what's happened with the National Land Commission, and in some ways entirely predictable. So the way in which, in my view, the NLC has been defanged has been not unexpected. And here again, we have a critical resource. That critical resource is the NLC advisory opinion, and I think that should be more widely taught than it possibly is. It's the advisory opinion is extremely dense, and it does one thing exceptionally well, and that is to give an excellent and very thorough history of land in Kenya. If you were to read just that, I think you would benefit hugely from the advisory opinion. But subsequently, the opinion, I think, was for me a letdown, because it didn't do what I think it should have done to bolster the position of the NLC. And I think that the advisory opinion by the Supreme Court gave too much credence to the idea that the NLC and the Land Ministry were equal partners, and that somehow they could go away and sort out their problems as equal partners. It paid no attention to the fact that the Land Ministry was the incumbent, and that it therefore had certain power. It knew the terrain, just knew the terrain better. The NLC was new, it was still fledgling. It needed to be bolstered and supported, including by giving it an independent budget, and that the Supreme Court didn't do, and I'm quite open in my critique of this. So the advisory opinion saw the NLC, saw the debate, saw the terms of the debate very much in private law terms, and didn't see the opportunity at, it talked about land registration powers, for example, but didn't see this as a key public law issue. How do we support the NLC to do the kind of public law work that it was envisaged as doing? It was a key demand. It's been a key demand for many years, even before the CKLC. Something like the NLC was envisaged in the Jonjo report way back. But the NLC hasn't had the support that it needed in order to function. And in the end, the advisory opinion saw the NLC as simply having a kind of brains trust function. So I talk about the NLC as being very much a thinker rather than a doer. Nothing wrong with thinking. Of course, it's important to have a research agenda, really important. But if you can't transfer that research agenda, for example, on historical land injustices, into actual change, you can't actually initiate any doing, any action, then the scope for your action is very narrow and indeed. So for me, that wrangle between the NLC and the Ministry of Lands is the key place to go if you want to look at the struggle for re-centralization that has happened since the Constitution. If the NLC was supposed to be one way of decentralizing land and reducing the centralizing power of the ministry and the corruption and so on that we all know is its backstory, then this was a key experiment. And in fact, what you see instead is a really strong re-centralization drive in relation to these two bodies.
Great. Thank you for giving us answers to those questions. We have two callers on the line. Who is coming first?
Evans,
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Great.
Okay. Evans, in a minute, ask your question or make your comment.
Quick comment. The resonant theme in all this discussion and with all other discussions involving the Constitution is that we have a political problem to the problems that bedevil us as Kenya. Politics has been an impediment to our progress. And my simple answer is this: we have to get it right with the politics. And if the politicians cannot get the message right, let them remember the words of Honore Riquetti, Comte Barabou, during the French Revolution, who, agitated by the politicians, said it simply, that tell the one who sent you that we are here by the courtesy of the people. And if you are not going to heed that call, we will only move by the force of the bayonets. So the politicians must know that there's a revolution preparing if they continue to impede the collective progress of the state. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a revolution waiting to happen. That's what Evans Ogada says. Next.
PKT.
PK, can you hear us?
PK. All right, we'll move to the next one. Boaz Waruku. Boaz Waruku, are you there?
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right, maybe I'll just
sorry,
go there.
because I couldn't see the icon for unmuting. Thank you very much. I am happy to join you guys in this very interesting discussion. And right from the outset, I think I was really carried by the presentation given by Prof, questioning the rationale of using the law to resolve the land question. And indeed, I think based on experience, from the time that I started hearing the discussion about the land question, indeed, even as of today, I think that question is really yet to be clarified to the very distilled, to the very final end. But bits and pieces of it still make me get worried. Why? Because I think the indication that we are using the law to try to resolve a matter, which from the outset was not a legal question. I think from the outside, then you're seeing that we had communities that owned resources around themselves, and the way that radically changed. I don't know, that is called radical, because when that changed with the coming on board of the colonialists, who then start imposing certain laws, telling you that now you cannot move from point A to B. And subsequently, even the political leadership taking over. I think I would have wished to listen to, that was Smith or somebody who talked about the coastal land question. I would have been very keen to hear how a president just wakes up and declares that all the beach plots, first, second, I think first and second rows, can only be given by his consent. And having this hegemony of provincial administration, which constantly, actually, we still have it to date, that determines who owns land, where, and for what purpose. So for me, I think the law that we are dealing with is a superimposition on the structure of the communities as they were. We are trying to push down a legal framework on them. And we are doing so from a very elitist standpoint, to the extent that I would equate it to somebody coming to your home, finding how you are managing your affairs, and start telling you that from today henceforth, you will not push or plant trees along this wall or along this area. I think before we resolve those issues of construction, I mean, the very basic aspect of it, before we resolve those, it would really be very difficult to talk of resolving the land question. And all that we are talking about, I think, whether we, however much we'll research on the law, we'll still find the law wanting, because the land issue in Kenya is about communal understanding of what their inheritance is and how all those resources given to them by their creator, Ngai, Nyasai, and all those, how somebody came and totally disoriented them before they could even realize they were being told, if you don't have a title, then you don't actually own that land. And you've seen, I think, I was looking at the cases of That is a shoya. Those cases which simply try to tell you the way we perceived land ownership, or rather land as a very basic part of our livelihoods. I think before we resolve those, then I'm not looking at a legal or a legal resolution to that coming soon. We must backpedal or go backwards before we find our bearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Boaz.
Thank you very much, Boaz. And I think you are in agreement with the panelists, and I take that as a comment. And panelists on the land issue, we are going to come back to you because towards the end to see how we complete this conversation. One of the conversation that seems to be going on the comment section, for example, is about traditional systems, African systems, customary system, and I think the question seems to be asking, is it possible to go back to the colonial phase or some date before the colonies came? Is it possible to bring that system now? How would that be in the recent economic setup? I think that is something we can try and explore as our parting shot later in this conversation. But for now, allow me to move to something else that is also very interesting and related to land, and that is the issue of the environment. If you look at the chapter 5, you will see that environment comes in, and I think claims at least two good articles there, 69 and 70 of the Constitution. We are also familiar with Article 42 of the Constitution, which touches on the right to a clean and healthy environment. And to take us through that will be Dr. Gashenga. Dr. Gashenga, are you around? Can you hear us?
Yes, I am.
Yes. I hope you'll be able to take us through this because we have been taking a lot of time on land. Now we want to hear you take us through environment. And one of the things that I personally think about is, for example, Article 69. It has beautiful, very beautiful provisions there. And they're actually stated as obligations. The exciting one, for example, is the one on forest cover, requiring us, for example, to have 10% of our land covered by the forest. I'm always curious, do we have that already? Where are we on some of these obligations listed in Article 69? What's your take on that, Prof? Karibu sana.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mbani. So what I'll do is I'll try and take you through, I mean, this is a huge, it's a huge area, but I'll try and do my best to just give a bit of a background before I go in and explain and give what actually is my take. So as Smith rightly put it, we're 10 years after enactment of the promulgation of the Constitution, and it's a good time to be asking ourselves questions. So I'll pick up from what some of the speakers are alluding to, which is we must always start by asking ourselves, what was the objective of the Constitution? So in our case, it was, the famous Wanjiko, or maybe we should say the infamous Wanjiko question, which was that the Constitution was intended to respond to this, the aspirations of the people. So in answering the question that Mbani has thrown at me, I think we have to first start by asking ourselves what exactly was intended by the provisions of the Constitution with respect to Article 42. And then those obligations that were set out in Article 69, as well as the provisions in Article 70, what exactly was it that was intended, and have we responded to this? So very quickly, Article 42 talks about the right to a clean and healthy environment and gives a few more details with respect to that. And Kenya has been lauded for including that provision in the Constitution because not too many countries have it. I think there are less than 100 countries that actually have an explicit reference to the right to a clean and healthy environment. And the whole question of what exactly this has achieved is something that's going on, not just in Kenya, so we shouldn't bash ourselves too much as Kenyans, but it's actually a question that is being asked with respect to other countries that have the provision, including questioning of the international environmental law and whether it actually achieves its objectives. So the IUCN recently had a big debate in which scholars were asking themselves, given all the provisions we have with respect to environmental law and protection of the environment, how is it that, okay, we're where we are with respect to the COVID virus, yeah? So So the fact that law is not a panacea is a question that cuts across not just the Kenyan constitution, but as far as international law. So, where exactly are we? So first and foremost, I think it's important for us to recognize that pre the 2010 constitution, we had very interesting issues with respect to implementing and asserting the rights to a clean and healthy environment. And I think here, when we talk about that period, we always think about Wangari Maathai. Yeah, so you remember Wangari Maathai and her attempt in the Kenya Times Media Trust to take us to discuss that issue of land and to see how she could use the law to actually stop the encroachment of Uhuru Park. And you remember what happened, right? She was quickly kicked out on the basis that she had absolutely no locus standi, she had no legal standing, and she could not represent the interests of the community. So judges who were trying to be forward-looking would try and stretch Section 71, which is of the Independence Constitution, which relates the right to life, to try and see how to salvage that issue of, you know, how do we protect the environment? How do we foster public interest litigation, despite the fact that there is no clear explicit provision in the law? So I think it's a good thing. It's progress that Article 42 was included. And by including that provision, it actually gives a substantive right to, it gives us a substantive right to a clean and healthy environment. And then it goes further to state the specific obligations with respect to that provision. Now, as Ambani has said it, when you look at Section 69, it's really and truly aspirational. So, I mean, first and foremost, it has a wide sweeping statement, which you shall see in my next slide, that relates to sustainable development in essence. Yeah. So when you look at that article, it talks about the sustainable exploitation, utilization, management and conservation of the environment and natural resources, talks about equitable sharing of accruing benefits. It goes as far as talking about, now this is the entire article, starts to talk about intellectual property in terms of managing the indigenous knowledge of the people, of the communities, over genetic resources, you know, prevention of harmful toxic matters from gaining into the environment. So it's a really and truly, really wide and encompassing article. And therefore, Dr. Ambani, when we start to judge how far we've gone, I think first and foremost, we have to ask ourselves whether that provision was not extremely aspirational, and probably it would not be fair for us to be judging those state obligations in the context of a 10-year period. Yeah, why? Because 10 years seems like a long time, especially for a millennial. And I know some of the people attending this are some of our students. But for a constitution, it's actually a very, we're very young from a constitutional perspective. So I thought maybe to contrast two cases in order for us to see how we can respond to that question. So you know that we've had a serious case in terms of, we had serious issues with respect to pollution caused by plastics, yeah? And you know, we all know about the recent, well, not so recent anymore, the ban on the use of single-use plastics, yeah? And we saw, yeah, we had seen this, you know, back and forth discussions, which actually predated the 2010 constitution, on, you know, let's try as much as possible to see how we can regulate the use of plastic bags. And what would end up happening is that political interests, yeah, so you'd have conversations, you'd actually have bills put forward in parliament. If you look at the hand side, you start to see how many times the people who would bring the provisions forward oftentimes were shot down, the majority of parliament. And behind the scenes, what was claimed was that, you know, there was a lot of industry interests, and that was actually influencing how far we would go with the conversations on, on use of plastics. And this became evident after the ban was instituted through that famous case of the Kenyan Association of Manufacturers, who then sued, you know, practically everyone, yeah, from the cabinet secretary to the Ministry of Environment. So, I mean, that already is a manifestation of some of the things that were happening behind the scenes before we actually had explicit provisions in the constitution. Now, when you look at the ruling of the judges and the argument that was used, there was a lot of reliance on Article 42 of the Constitution, as well as Article 69 and 70. Okay, not to mention other provisions that allow for coming up with laws in the way that they actually did. We could ask ourselves, in the absence of those provisions in the Constitution, would the CS and the surrounding authorities, would they have actually been able to implement that ban on plastics? Yeah. Now, it's true, as is coming from the discussion here, that you need more than just the law. But is the law, do we agree, or can we possibly deny that the law is a good place to start? Yeah, because without the law, as we've seen in the case of Wangari Maathai, there was no reprieve. Yeah, and what ended up happening is that it was, the revolutionary kind of perspective that we're alluding to here, where you have one person who's willing to sacrifice themselves to actually achieve the objective. So when you look at the case on the ban on plastics, we see, yes, we've made some progress, not without its challenges, but I'd say we are, if we use the provisions of the Constitution properly, we can actually make some progress. Contrast that with the case of the Nairobi River cleanup, which I think is what's most closest to us, yeah, especially those of us who are tuning in from Nairobi. And, we've seen the politicization of that whole process. Okay, there was, the role of the county government, the inclusion of young people, the participation of the members of some of the inhabitants of the slum area that are adjacent to the river in the context of their contributing to the pollution of the river. NEMA throwing its weight, yeah, we would often see people on television. Remember the whole Green Mamba, yeah, that's tractor, demolition tractor that became famous at that particular point because they were getting rid of any buildings that happened to be blocking the flow and the stream, the flow of the Nairobi River. Now, all that, of course, was intended to ensure that we had a cleaner river. And I think all of us probably asking ourselves the question as to, how much have we achieved what it is that we intended to achieve? Yeah. So is the Nairobi River cleaner? Yeah. We saw buildings come down. I think in Strathmore, we're lucky to have the river flowing at the back of the university, and we've lived it. Yeah. We've seen buildings like the South End Mall come down because of the fact that, it was in the way of the river. Even Strathmore actually suffered it. Yeah? We had to bring down a wall because of riparian land issues commissioned by NEMA. I shall not talk about the process that was being followed because oftentimes there were extrajudicial processes that were being used. But then soon after, what do we see? New buildings coming up in more or less the same places where buildings had been brought down, quite close, yeah, and seeming to encroach the riparian part of the river. So you begin to ask yourself, okay, yes, we have these provisions in law, but sometimes the law doesn't seem to work, yeah, which is, I think, what we're saying here, oftentimes that, one thing is to have the law, another thing is when it comes to the implementation of the law, then we see all these issues that can actually take away from the provisions of the law. And then moving on to my next slide on Article 70, we could ask ourselves, what progress have we made in terms of justiciability? Yeah, because Article 70 was intended to ensure that Article 42 was an enforceable article, yeah, and that it could take us to places where we hadn't been prior to the Constitution, especially with respect to the question of standing, and also the orders that were available to the courts to push that whole agenda of ensuring the right to a clean and healthy environment. What would I say? We've made some gains. We've seen some growing jurisprudence in the area of environment, albeit always overshadowed by land. As you've seen already from this presentation we're having, yeah? When you put environment and land together, because of the emotive nature of land and the historical issues relating to land, you can understand that land then takes priority, even in these environmental land courts. Yeah? So yes, we've seen some amount of growing jurisprudence. So I think that's progress. The fact that there are cases, there's more public interest litigation coming forward with respect to different things. I think one of the most recent one that is quite interesting is an individual who took the Council of Governors to court, including the Urban Roads Authority, both the rural and the urban. And the argument here was that they had erected toilets during the construction of the roads, the highways, but that they were charging people to gain access to those public toilets. Yeah, so the argument was the state has an obligation to ensure that that the environment is clean and healthy, sanitation is provided. So by stopping us from using those public toilets without making a payment, that they were actually, the state was failing to fulfill its obligations, and they were actually they were overlooking, or it was going against the right to Article 42, which is the right to a clean and healthy environment. And actually, I encourage you to look at that ruling, because whereas it's true, they didn't actually gain what exactly it is that they intended, because, okay, Kura came back and said, look, is it practical and feasible to require us to actually build toilets along all the highways that we're coming up with? And actually, should it even be our responsibility, given that the county government is the one that is responsible for matter sanitation? But I think just the fact that we're able to have such conversations is actually, it's a way forward. The Joseph Lebo case, where there was this whole questioning of tree harvesting, and the orders made against the director of Kenya Forest Services was again a step forward in terms of what we can do, thanks to the provisions in the Constitution at the moment, including the obligations that they said they require the state to fulfill. Now, what is one of the challenges, and this is not only with respect to this article, or even just with respect to the provisions of the Constitution, I think one of the greatest challenges is usually enforcement. So in the case of the African Center for Rights and Governance, this is actually the case around the Karai dam site, where this particular institution organization was challenging the creation of a dump site without public participation, with all the negative impacts of that dump site. And Munyao Sila ruling on it actually gave orders, but very clear orders as to what should be done. That a proper EIA, failure of which the county was required to shut the dump site. What happens? Totally ignored. So those orders were ignored. Attempts, contempt of court proceedings, but we all know how that usually goes. So that's a challenge. So yes, you could have the law, you could have the protection of the law, but then what exactly happens when we get to the point of implementation? And moving to my last slide, when we seek to talk about how far have we come, I think one of the things that came up with respect to wicked problems that changed the whole idea of systems thinking, how to resolve problems. This was a context outside the law, but that the essence of that that notion and concept of wicked problems, I think, is being used across all disciplines, and here I'm using it for purposes of this question of the question of environment. So we have to accept that, some of these questions, including this particular one and the land question, are they're critical, or they're very good examples, I'd say, of wicked problems. Why wicked problems have no clear solution. Oftentimes you can't really get to a point where you say, now, yes, we've solved the problem. There's no litmus test of seeing whether or not we're solving the problem. So they're the kind of questions which create a discussion which perhaps continues over a period of time and may never stop. Why? Because it has a lot of facets. It's a multifaceted kind of problem. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it's complex and it has no clear or final solution. But like I've said, it's a yes and no kind of situation. Yes, we've made some progress thanks to the provisions of the Constitution. The state, yes, is attempting to fulfill some of its obligations, or at least is being pushed towards fulfilling the obligations. But there are also other complexities that surround it. So remember that I said Article 69, sub-article 1, especially A, talks about the whole notion of sustainable development. We know where we are in terms of our developmental trajectory. And that oftentimes raises a critical question, not just for the government, but I think even for us, as citizens of Kenya. how do we strike the balance? Yeah, how do we protect the environment, but still allow ourselves to attain certain aspects of developmental progress? Yeah, so here I'm looking at the SGR with all the issues that it brought about with respect to the wildlife, yeah, at the park. There's the whole concept of the Gibe Dam with the Friends of Lake Turkana, raising issues with respect to, you know, what impact it was going to have on the community. And the list is endless, yeah, showing how, yes, on the one hand, we do need to protect the environment, but there are also all these other questions that come up with respect to development. And then I think, I forget who it was, I don't know whether it was Ogada or somebody actually made a very good point in the Q&A, the previous Q&A on land, which is, we have systemic questions. Yeah, we have systemic issues that, you know, affect how we deal with all the provisions of the Constitution. A lot of that relates to corruption, the politics surrounding it. And I think somebody said, you know, unless we are clear in terms of the political process, it's going to be very difficult for us to make progress. Yeah. Again, there's the issue of financial resources. We could, you know, require the government to do many things, but as the case in South Africa with the right to everybody having clean water, you remember what happens. Yeah, that's the Mazibuko case. How do you compel the government to suddenly resolve issues that have existed over a long period of time? Yeah. So the whole concept of progressive realization of rights. So in assessing the obligations of the states and how they've done, these are all questions that we have to have at the back of our mind. Yeah. I think a lot has been said about extra legal norms, and I'm glad that they've been discussed, because, you know, in order for us to change behavior, oftentimes it's not just about the law. Yeah, we have to make some changes to extra legal norms, yeah, which eventually will actually help the state to achieve what it is that the state is seeking to achieve. Yeah, and probably, as indicated in my very last slide, this was the second last one, is, you know, to quote this quotation from Wangari Maathai is, I think, critical here, which is, human rights are not things that are put on the table and then now suddenly we can enjoy them. Yeah, these are things you fight for and then you seek to protect. Yeah, so have we made progress? Yes. Was there an advantage of having the law? Yes. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And, you know, challenge to the students, especially who are here, you're the future. The provisions now are present in the Constitution. Let's see whether we can achieve what it is that Wanjiku intended to achieve. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I send it back to you, Ambani. Wow. Hoping that I answered the question somewhat. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. But left me again thinking how I wish I wasn't moderating so that I could have time to reflect on all these great ideas. But I don't have that time now. And you end on the issue of fighting. I think that's what Wangari Maathai is saying there. And it seems to tally with the land participants in a sense. I think we really need to close with that later in the last 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes or so. This issue of fighting for our rights, it seems to be the way to go because when we say the law has limits, when we say the hyenas are taking care of this, how do we deal with that? But anyway, that's just for the future of this conversation. If I would summarize what you said, I think you are telling us very, very nicely here that there was a past, and the past is that one of, say, Wangari Maathai, when even standing was not possible before courts of law. For those who are old enough to remember. Courts told her, how have you suffered? You're not even entitled to be here. We're coming from there to a position where we even now have Article 70, and we're all being guaranteed capacity to come before courts to enforce environmental rights. We're being guaranteed the right to environment at Article 42. And I think you have shown that there has been progress in the law. You've also shown that through this framework, actually, we've made some progress. For example, the ban of plastics. No one believed that was going to happen, but it actually happened. And then we have this back and forth with the Nairobi River, quite interesting back and forth there. And so you conclude properly, I think, and I agree rightly that back, yes, forward, but I think we have made progress. You also say something that is quite apt for discussion. I wish we had more time. For example, how do we measure success in 10 years, for example? The lofty provisions of Article 69 of the Constitution, you know, can they be measured in 10 years? You know, that's quite so aspirational to begin realizing them in 10 years. So perhaps we need to invent a measurmeter, you know, a tool that we can measure progress with, you see. That would be interesting to see how that then can help us understand where we are at in terms of constitutional implementation. But as you spoke, and especially when you challenged when you challenged Article 69 and how aspirational it was, I kept asking, if I gave you one test, and just one simple test, supposing someone were to come up with the same project that they are trying to come up with in the 80s, to put up a mega investment in Uhuru Park, would they succeed today? I think that would be for me the test. Can they do it today? And as I speak, by the way, I'm aware that there's a highway coming all the way from Lolongo, going past Westlands, which is actually eating into Uhuru Park, just a bit. Almost where Professor Mbrina was saying, and what I equated to the rat policy. Yeah, bite and blow. I don't know, can that person succeed now, Dr. Gashenge? If in a minute you have to respond to that, what would be your take on that question?
That's a very good question, Dr. Ambani. It would not be so easy to say whether or not they'll succeed. I think what's critical here is that at least they would have the law on their side for them to question whether or not the environmental rights were being encroached. Yeah, you see, for example, look at the conversation we had around the SGR when it was going through the national park. We now at least have a provision in the law that leads us to challenge such decisions by government, yeah, by the state. Of course, like I said, there's a whole argument of, you know, balance between development as well as conservation of the environment. And that, I'm sure, is a conversation that would come into play. You know, we have the whole context of how effective our environmental impact assessments are, because again, those are some of the things that unfortunately have worked against us. I haven't seen the EIA for that highway, but I'm almost 100% sure that it says that yes, we will look after and conserve the environment and we'll do all these things, etc. But then we know how it is in reality. So would we succeed? Maybe not, yeah, based on past experience, but at least we would have a conversation that would force the state to respond or to be held accountable for certain things. Look at the wind farm cases of Kinangop, yeah, which incidentally happens to be where I come from. You know, thanks to the push from the community, the pushback, we know that eventually we didn't get there. Yeah, so there's hope. I'd say there's hope.
To add on Dr. Osogo's question, right now as we speak, such mega projects have already been implemented. What sort of recourse do people who have been aggravated by such mega projects, what sort of recourse could they have?
Okay, so
those people who have been, yeah, go on, Dr. Gashenga.
Okay. The people who've been negatively impacted, right?
Yes.
Okay, so once the project is up and running, of course, oftentimes, unfortunately, the horse has bolted from the station, yeah, because the project is already there. But I think the state, thanks to the provisions of the Constitution and the legislation that has come up subsequently, there are provisions in the law that allow people who are aggrieved to go back to the state and require them to mitigate some of the negative impacts, which oftentimes have been foreseen in the EIA, in the environmental impact assessment, and for which the government has actually some responsibility in mitigating. So they can fall back on these provisions and push back to gain some mitigation. Yeah? As I said, these are usually processes that are not easy. Even this whole public interest litigation, oftentimes the ending is that each party should bear its costs, yeah? Which obviously discourages many people from taking such suits forward. But yes, they do have redress in the sense that they can go forward and say, look, the state failed in its obligations and therefore they have a responsibility to mitigate some of the negative and adverse impacts that this particular development project has had on the community surrounding. So And just even the whole concept of benefit sharing, you know that now we have a local content bill, so that, you know, if you extract extractives, you hit the environment, but surely you must give back to the community. And now there's laws and provisions in the law that give a basis to the community to actually question that.
Great, great, great. I think what I get from you now is, I think now I'm clear that yes, they can still go on with the violations, but they'll meet serious obstacles on their way. And I think that's a plus. I think we've made progress, you know, we're moving forward in a sense on the environmental front. Lastly, we have Ishak Khatib, who works in the Save Lamu. And Ishak has been instrumental in doing work at the coast, advocacy work, and even going to court. And I think Ishak is rightly placed to actually take us through Article 170 of the Constitution, whether we can actually enforce our environmental rights practically. Is it possible? And can we get success there? Ishak, I don't know, is it possible to address us on this issue? And probably in like 6 minutes so that we can allow one round of questions and then conclude the conversation. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Mbani. The truth is, yes, there is a way of getting justice at the court. And the only thing is we have to realize that we must utilize time wisely and forever realize that the time is always ripe to do right. Because it's not easy. When we discuss on the issues of land and environment, or when we discuss of the issue of environment, you cannot distract environment without getting into land. So these are the two issues that they're always together. And sincerely speaking, is it depends. It depends, because when we go through the Constitution, the Constitution, it clearly says that Article 1, that the sovereign power of this Constitution belong to the people themselves. So this, I can use this article to answer the question of Professor Ambrina, yeah? When he say, should we put faith in this Constitution? Yes, we should put faith. It's only us that we can make sure that this Constitution is well implemented. Well implemented. It's only depends on how you'll try to get things into justice. The thing is, we have several success stories on this. Save Lamu is just a CBO. You can't imagine. It's just a CBO. But just imagine the way we sent a lapset to the court, and we won. And we won. The 5 judges bench, they said that we have the hybrid case. The hybrid case. And we only focused, we based on Article 42, 69, and 70. Though we have several other articles, like on the Bill of Rights, we have Article 22, Article 258, and many others. But we clearly based on those articles, 42, 69, and 70. And it was very sad because we as civilians, as indigenous people of Lamu, we were not aware of this spot. We only saw the government brought the caterpillars. They started breaking houses. They started make roads. They started distracting mangroves like 5 acres. And then we came to realize what's really happening. What's really happening? So when we call upon the advice from the lawyers, we got this organization they call Natural Justice. We brought Natural Justice, and they give us idea on what to do. So we seek lawyers, and we got very many partners because we did demonstrations. awareness on what does the Constitution says relating to. So we got a very hard time, like harassment, threats, beating, and we also got some issues like maybe the issue of disappearance. I myself, my uncle has disappeared. It's almost 3 years now, and it's only because of the issue of land. So when we talk of the issue of land, and when we took the Constitution, you'll see the only problems that we have, or the lack of implementation, is only on the land issues and environment. Mostly it's on land and environment. Why? Because even if you see the Constitution has changed many things in terms of land. For example, like from the crown land or the government land to the public and the community and private. Those are the 3 categories of owning land. And you see, the problem was when they were called crown lands, the government are the ones who they were controlling. So when we talk of this, why did I bring this thing in? It's because, let's go back when the organizations, NGOs push for the Community Land Act to be signed by the government. I mean, by the president at the parliament. We took a lot of time, just because they knew that there is a port in Lamu, there's a lapset, and there is other issues, mega projects that they intended to do. So once they sign that community land, then that means they will be having a hard time in implementing their own issues. So what I can say is the Constitution, the articles. Yes?
Isaac, in 1 more minute, any other success you've had at Save Lamu in a minute, so that we see how practical this is.
The coal issue, the coal project. The coal project, yes, we use the same articles, Article 70 and Article 42 and 69, and we send the petition to the court, and the court decided that the license should be reviewed. So we won the case also.
Great. I think that's fantastic. I think Ishak is actually demonstrating that this Constitution can give you rights. That it's actually a living document that could give you benefit ultimately. Yes.
It's only for the implementation of the Constitution. Let us be clear. It's only depend on those who are fighting and the lawyers you use. Yes.
Actually, again, Ishak is actually reinforcing what Dr. Gashenga already said, that there has to be some fight for these rights, isn't it? But when you fight and you could actually engage the Constitution as part of the battlefront, you'll actually get some benefits out of it. I think that's being proved, that at least on the environmental side. I think I want to conclude this conversation. And to conclude, I think we can ask every speaker to have some 30 seconds to say just a punchline to conclude the conversation. Especially, I'm interested in the way forward. Where do you think we are going? Can we start with you, Smith?
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm very happy that we've had this conversation. And I'm very excited to hear from everybody and to see how the Constitution is actually, how we're breathing life into the constitutional provisions through struggles, through vigilance by the communities being affected by these issues, by lawyers, though we all ultimately agree that lawyers now should take a backseat and watch how the communities or groups that are affected by these issues drive the narratives. But what I could also say that, I mean, we need this vigilance, but also we should not lose faith in the law and in the institutions provided by the law, because we know what the alternative will be, especially for something like land, which is very emotive, which is strikes a very deep chord amongst a lot of our societies. And we see these groups, these communities, taking their claims before legally recognized institutions, which is something that is very laudable, because we know what the alternative will be based on our experiences in 2007, based on our experiences in 1992, and even before that. So what I will say as a parting shot is that we need institutions like the National Land Commission to respond to this call and to this mandate that they've been vested by the Constitution. We already know that the Commission has effectively embroiled itself in this politics of recentralization. It is in a way ceding its jurisdiction to other entities, other agencies of the central government, like the Kenya Forest Services. We see what is happening to the Sengwer in Embobut Forest. So the Commission should respond to this call that and to this mandate that it has been given by the Constitution, and in a way faithfully implement those duties or those responsibilities that it has been vested with by the Constitution. But we as a public also must maintain the vigilance that we are expected to have, because the implementation of this Constitution will depend on how much vigilant we are. But thank you very much. It was very informative to be on this panel and to learn from everybody. And just one thing, I think I saw a question by a student as to how students being trained in the law.
Less than 30 seconds. Less than 30 seconds.
30 seconds, yeah. And I think Ambrina has in the past written on how lawyers are implicated in these land questions and land dispossession effectively. So as students, we need to know that it is our responsibilities as lawyers to ensure that justice is done and the Constitution, the spirit of the Constitution, we live by the spirit of the Constitution, and we ensure that its implementation to the letter. So thank you very much, everybody.
Great. Yeah, as we do our parting shots, let's keep less than a minute. And already the questions that are pending relate to the practical achievement of the Constitution. What can we do practically? Practical solution, not just academic, answers. Let's go to you, Professor Ambrina. Parting shot.
I think we need the practical solutions, absolutely. But before we have the practical solutions, we need the ideas. The solutions have to be driven by ideas. And who do those ideas come from? They don't come first from the lawyers, right? So of course you need excellent lawyers. Of course you need courageous courts. Everything that Elizabeth and Ishak have said is absolutely right and really important, because you see that progress is possible, or at least it's possible to put barriers in the way of injustices being perpetuated against people. But before any of that is possible, before it's possible to bring on board your excellent lawyers, before it's possible to plead in front of a court, what do you need? You need you need self-organization. You need people to self-organize first and to set out the terms on which they want to argue the case and on the terms on which they see the injustice being perpetuated. You need all of that first. You need people's self-organization first before there's any role for us as lawyers and as law students or as legal academics. And I think that's what, for me, came out of Ishak's presentation, is the terms of the discussion are set by the people, because we can't rely, we know this, we cannot rely on our state to represent what it is that the people demand or want. We know this a lot on the axis of gender, for example. We have a state that takes no account of women's labor, has no idea who Wanjiku actually is. They throw Wanjiku in at every conversation. What Wanjiku actually does every day in terms of her labor, in terms of her reproductive work, in terms of her struggles, they have no idea. You can't expect the state or the Constitution to set that up for you. You need the people to set that up for you, to keep saying it. So we've said it, it's read into the Constitution, we said it to the CKRC, but we need to keep saying it. And I think that's where Ishak's presentation is so important, that you need to say it as a self-organized community, and then you need to say it, as Elizabeth shows, before the courts repeatedly.
Great, great. Karaoke?
Okay,
Karaoke, a parting shot?
Mine is
very brief.
The organizers, Strathmore University and ICJ Kenya, for inviting me for this fantastic session, and also my panelists, because they have shared very nice ideas, and I am wiser now. But I think as I end, I would say that mine, I think perhaps we could deploy a more multifaceted approach, where we combine, for example, the self-mobilization that Prof is talking about, where our communities, can come together, organize and fight, because this is a struggle. This is a fight. We can't, as Wangari Maathai says in the quote by Dr. Gashenga, we have to fight for these rights. So I think a more multifaceted approach, mobilization. Again, we can also try to see what we can harness from, the court processes, because there have been successes, like what Khatib has said. So we can deploy that also. And just to end on the issue of the fighting, I think we must also realize that even to come to where we are, even to be an independent state, it is our people, our local peoples who mobilized, who came together and organized and waged the war or the fight for independence. And I think we have to think about that, because unless we push against the political class, they will keep on, pushing us, to the edge. And again, as I end, we also need to also consider, trying to see what solutions can we get from, the other normative orders, from customary, governance systems, from those traditional institutions, because these customary systems are still there. That's why even in the justice system, we are now talking about traditional justice systems. That's why even in the land sector, we are still talking about, the largest percentage of land being community land. So there is something with the communal governance systems that we have not truly harnessed. And I think it's time, even as we deploy all these other approaches towards fighting for our land rights and fighting for environmental rights, we also try and see what can we draw from customary governance systems. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Chome? Chome, are we able to do that in 30 seconds? Chome?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think I agree with the parting shots that have already been given. And I think for the lawyers, not being a lawyer or legal expert myself, but I think that it would be important for especially the students who are thinking about engaging in some of these struggles to pay attention to the wider social, political, cultural issues that are also involved in these struggles between communities, the government, or poor and rich people, and I mean, which is usually kind of the case in these struggles. So it is very important to kind of be aware not only of the legal questions but also of the wider social political context in which these struggles take place.
Thank you. Dr. Gashenga, parting shot.
Yes, thank you. So mine would be 3 S's for the sake of remembering. So one I will plagiarize, but my first one was sensitization. So get the people to understand what their rights are in the Constitution, which will help them get to Professor Mbrina's proposal of self-mobilization. Then strengthen institutions. Yeah, so excellent institutions provided in the Constitution, including the ELC, the Environment Land Court. Let's get the right judges in that court. Yeah, because already we are seeing the few right judges we have are making a lot of progress in that area. And then the final S is, let's soldier on. Yeah, it's only 10 years. So let's not bash ourselves too much. But then again, let's not sit back. So especially for the youngsters who are here, let's soldier on. Let's keep the spirit of the Constitution where it should be, and let's make sure it becomes a live document. And thank you, Dr. Mbani and organizers, for inviting me.
Thank you. 3S. Ishak, finally.
What I can say is thank you very much for this session, and for us to win, let's have the word justice as a slogan in our brain. And if we really want to bring justice, or to make sure the implementation of the Constitution is okay, then we also need to avoid being political, or to avoid being divided and ruled by the state. Thank you.
Okay. Wow, I think for me, we had promised a constitutional overdose, but I think it was more than that. It was an explosion. That's what I saw today. And I think the message I take home is the struggle continues, isn't it?
This was absolutely an overdose. Thank you so much, Dr. Ambani. As we all agree, whilst land provides a livelihood for most Kenyans, it is still the most inequitably distributed natural resource since colonialism, or even before. Understanding that land is critical in socioeconomic lives of all Kenyans, successive governments, as well as socioeconomic and political elites, have maintained its control to the disadvantage of the common mwananchi. That is a fact that we have discussed here. Now, in 2010, while most of the Kenyan citizens readily accepted a new constitution, the elites have impeded its implementation, thus aggravating inequities and historical land injustices. We have seen, we have a transformative constitution that contemplated equal distribution of resources, including land. As we have all discussed here, we have agreed that we need a holistic approach towards addressing this issue, going back to history, looking at where we are and deciding where we want to go. So we need to come up with ideas and pragmatic solutions and approaches to address this issue. As we address this issue, thank you so much for all of you. Please join us in tweeting and retweeting. Please join us in putting this in social media. You can tweet on our handles at ICJ Kenya, Strathmore Law Kabarak, hashtag Tekeleza Katiba, hashtag Katiba Series. Thank you so much all. Please join us next week as we discuss the issues of national security, putting all this in context and seeing how this has affected the national security of all Kenyans. As we finish, I would like to finish with a quote from a renowned lawyer, Mahatma Gandhi, who said, the earth has everything to give to our needs, but not to satisfy all our greed. Thank you so much and join us next week. See you next week. Thank you.